Welcome to Sports Ophthalmology, a podcast for ophthalmologists and trainees interested in providing eye care to athletes. I am your host, Jared Tuttle. Join me as we hear from national leaders in this exciting subfield of ophthalmology. Today we have some exciting news. We have added 2 members to our sports ophthalmology executive team, Dacey and Conor Malone. In this episode, we get to know them better and also discuss a recent journal article on sports ophthalmology. Dacey is a rising 4th-year medical student at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Originally from Massachusetts, Sydney received her Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Boston College. She was a competitive swimmer for 16 years and finished out her career competing for Boston College's varsity team. While at Brown, she has led the Association of Women Surgeons and been involved with the Rhode Island Free Clinic and numerous research studies. She will be applying into ophthalmology later this year. Conor Malone is a cataract surgery fellow who has trained in Ireland and the United Kingdom. He received his medical degree from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, as well as master's degrees in health informatics from University College Dublin and the University of Limerick. Conor's research experience includes medical education and the application of technology in healthcare. He is interested in emergency ophthalmology and the prevention of eye injuries. All right, Sydney and Conor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jared. Excited to be here.
I would like everyone to get to know each of you a little bit better. Maybe Sydney, we'll start off with you. What led you to ophthalmology?
Yeah, so I came into medical school with, a goal of impacting quality of life. And, 3 years of being an athlete, I really had an interest in taking care of my own body and doing right things for my health. So preventive care has always been an interest of mine as well. I knew coming in, I wanted to do something more procedural, work with my hands. So I knew I had a few things to look into. And I initially looked into orthopedics. Anatomy wasn't as interesting to me. So I moved on to ENT, which I like the small procedures, but not some of the head and neck oncology. So it led me to ophthalmology. I knew I had to look into it despite not getting a lot of exposure throughout medical school. So I, started out shadowing, and then I did this longitudinal elective that we have at Brown, where I can go a half day a week throughout my 3rd year, just to get a little bit of exposure throughout the rest of the rotations. And, every time I went going from the other rotation, I just felt so at home and felt like it was the right place for me. I really enjoyed the anatomy. The patients were really interesting and the cases they came in with. And everyone seemed so happy in the field that I knew I could see myself doing it and just be, fulfilled in it. So kind of led me to settle on that and plan on applying into that later this year.
And tell me a little bit more about your interest in the intersection between sports and ophthalmology.
Yeah, so sports ophthalmology to me, honestly, there's 2 sides of it that I'm interested in. And one is, the trauma and reconstruction that can occur with an injury, whether it's in a sport, a competitive sport, or just recreationally. And I think, that's exciting just because you never know what's going to come in, and there's just creativity that's required to manage it. The other side of it that I kind of already touched on is just the preventive aspect of it, which to me is honestly more exciting because you get the opportunity to, prevent these injuries from occurring in the first place and having a, essentially a positive impact on whether it be an athlete's career or just a, recreational athlete's enjoyment in whatever they like to do on the side. So those are the 2 things that I'm most drawn to about it. And I think just, being an athlete, I know how important vision is in competition and how, devastating it can be when you miss out on a practice or competition or let alone a whole season. So seeing that side of it, I can only imagine what it would be like to, have your vision impacted during a sport. But, as a recreational athlete now, I know how impactful it can be just to lose out on that, when you're having fun doing something new. So for those aspects, I think that sports and ophthalmology together just really make a lot of sense. And I'm excited to continue to learn more about it through the people we have on the show.
Yeah, I think that being an athlete provides a unique perspective, and especially with your perspective as a collegiate athlete, that mentality of an athlete and also just logistics, like what you're saying, the cost of missing practice, leading to maybe losing your spot that you've worked so hard for. And so doctors have mentioned before the importance of, getting in and out. And so being an ophthalmologist that can facilitate seeing the patients, answering the consults quickly, getting the athletes back on the field, back in their sport makes a big difference. Conor, let's hear about your journey both to ophthalmology and then also with your interests in sports.
Sure. So when I started medical school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought orthopedics was interesting, and I still do. It's a great specialty. And ophthalmology was on the horizon, but it wasn't really until I was really lucky. I got to do a couple of weeks of ophthalmology all in one go, had really interesting lectures. They were really dedicated, and the surgery was fascinating. Met a lot of patients who were all willing to talk and tell me their experiences, and that was really what clinched it. And I loved orthopedics as well, but ophthalmology just had the edge for me. And it was, I think, the mixture of medicine, surgery, microsurgery, imaging. There's an academic side if you want it, and the technology. So I really love technology, and I always think being paid to shoot lasers is a great job. So it was kind of selfish from that point of view. And then the range of the work. So you have patients in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, all the way up to I've done cataract surgery on for people who are over 100 years of age, and they get 6/6 20/20 vision afterwards. It's so satisfying, and I think that's for me, that's where it rolls over into sports. So it's really interesting to watch high performing athletes and to hear how they structure their day and their entire lives. But for most of us, we don't ever experience that, but we should still be able to enjoy sports throughout our lives in the same way as we should enjoy good vision throughout our lives.
Yeah, and I mean, as ophthalmologists, you're keeping the active community, people that are being active, taking care of their bodies and being involved, and we're helping them keep moving. And whether they're professional athletes, collegiate athletes, and any level, the weekend warriors, it's also important to keep them moving, doing what they want to do.
Yeah, and we see in clinic, we see unfortunately, a lot of the more severe eye injuries, because the milder ones are looked after either by the patients themselves, they self-care, or they go to primary care. So, we can see some of the more serious injuries, but we want to be able to educate our colleagues in other specialties in primary care, and patients themselves to be able to, exactly as Sydney said, to prevent eye injuries. It's so important. But also if they do get an eye injury or an eye problem, to be able to look after that themselves so that they don't have to rely on secondary or tertiary care.
So Sydney and I are fresh from the ASOT meeting, Eye Trauma 2024, from ASOT, or the American Society of Ophthalmic Trauma. Sydney, I thought we could discuss just a few of the highlights from the meeting. Conor, I know you weren't able to make it, but maybe we could just hear a few of the takeaways you might have had from that conference.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was honestly amazing to see people come from all over the world to come together on a really, small subspecialty of ophthalmology. I think it was just, I honestly learned so much from the presenters and talking to folks who were there. So I think the two things that I took away, like my largest takeaways from the conference, I think one of the overarching themes was just the fact that, ophthalmic trauma is just an under-resourced side of ophthalmology, but such an important one. From what I was hearing, it sounds like there's just not enough, ophthalmologists taking call, and, inevitably related to hospital policies on compensation for these busy providers who are, they're busy during the day, and then to have to take call on these traumas that might be coming in at all hours of the night. It's just something that's they're in need of right now. Speaking to a few ophthalmic hospitalists was interesting, as that's a budding side of ophthalmology. So having that become a more present in the hospitals, I think will help with something like this, just, providing more care for these traumas that come in. And I think otherwise, another thing that I spoke a little bit about with folks was just the lack of education in ophthalmology for those who are not in ophthalmology. So it starts in medical school, where ophthalmology isn't really something that we learn a lot about. Some medical schools have a day of it or a few days, and some don't have really any during their preclinical years. And I think, providing education at some point in the career to people going into emergency medicine, primary care, just so that when an ophthalmic injury does come to you as a non-ophthalmologist, you know a little bit about how to triage that, where they should go, just so that there isn't either a miss in a trauma, but also so that there isn't like an over consultation of ophthalmologists, so that there isn't, an overload in work for those tending to things that might be more, impactful to vision or more emergent. So those are kind of two things that I think I gained from it that were overarching, and in addition to just the combination of things that I learned. So yeah, it was a great conference.
Yeah, I've spoken to some sports medicine physicians, and I mean, they're asked to keep track of a whole host of different things. Their specialty is generalizing, but specific to sports. And I've spoken to some sports medicine physicians that just any eye injury, just go to the ER, just like whatever it is. Oh, your eye hurts, go to the ER. And so that, I think that can contribute to some of the overburdenment that you're talking about. And that's something that, maybe if they can identify a corneal abrasion, identify some of those things, then that can facilitate ultimately better care, especially for the scared athlete who goes to the ER at midnight. There was one presentation in particular that I thought was interesting. They presented misdiagnoses from these types of referrals. And a big one was open globes, where they were referred to the large academic center for an open globe when once they got there, they didn't have an open globe. And off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was something about like of the 150 open globes that were referred, 22%, weren't actually open globes. And so that's something that, maybe just a little bit more careful of an exam, getting the eye open, maybe they're swollen, it's hard to see those types of things. But that was part of that discussion that was pretty shocking to me. There was another section on data to drive advocacy. And I think that that's relevant a lot for sports ophthalmology, because people don't see things as an issue unless there's data to support it. And I think that's useful. We want to use our resources towards things that are most meaningful, have the most impact. And it's the data that drives those decision makers. If you go to, hockey players and say, hey, you need to wear this mask, they're going to say, no, I don't want to wear this mask. But if you go with data saying, hey, X% of people are having these severely debilitating eye injuries, that makes not only the individual think differently, but also the policymaker, the big picture, people that are mandating rules or creating guidelines that can kind of change their mentalities on that. And Sydney, you did present some research as well. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so really kind of touches on what you were just talking about. So a few months back, I started working with Dr. Grayson Armstrong, who's the director of ophthalmology emergency services over at Mass Eye and Ear up in Boston. So we, started working on this project to explore the trends in epidemiology of a less talked about sport, but one that's important to me was swimming. So it's something that, it is an elite Olympic sport. And as we'll talk about soon in an article we're discussing, it's a lesser risk sport, thankfully, which is good, but it doesn't mean that ophthalmic injuries are non-existent. So we took a look into, over the last 10 years or so, the ophthalmic injuries that were found through the NEISS database system. And if you're not familiar with that, it's just a representative sample of emergency departments across the US that essentially collect case reports of injuries, put it into a large system that can then be combed through for different demographics and injuries and separated by, a lot of different factors. So really helpful to see injuries and, bring out the trends in them. So, briefly, the results that we found was essentially that men and women are about as equally likely to be injured when it is associated to swimming, pools, water sports, and any of the related equipment and apparel, which was the breakdown of, male versus female is different than the usual because a lot of times it's males that are more impacted by ophthalmic injuries in relation to sports. So that was something interesting. Otherwise, it was the pediatric age group that was more at risk, which is common, and conjunctivitis and abrasions were most seen. It was rare that a serious injury did occur, and less than 1% of these patients ended up being admitted to the hospital after their injury, but which is great. But there were, a few serious injuries such as ruptured globe, hyphema, vitriol, and retinal detachment. So it wasn't non-existent, but luckily, swimming is a lesser risk sport. That being said, it did provide us with some information about where, prevention in the future can start. Maybe talking with just kind of like our initial thoughts on it, or just, potentially working with some national swim organizations, particularly in the pediatric population, on getting the kids who are, swimming recreationally to wear goggles more often, because in the competitive sport of swimming, it's more common that you'll be wearing goggles, as it does help your performance. But in recreation, when kids are just roughhousing in the pool, swimming around, it's not as common to see goggles. So having that be more prevalent at public pools, especially in the summertime when these are most common. Otherwise, I think just focusing also on, chlorine and making sure that that's at a good level, because that's also something that has contributed to a good amount of injuries were chemical burns. So those are kind of the two main areas of focus for us moving forward. And hopefully we'll have some more information on that out soon.
All right. And that leads nicely into our article we were hoping to discuss today. Connor, do you mind introducing our article?
Sure. So I opened this article thinking that I wouldn't get that much out of it. The title is International Olympic Committee Consensus Paper on Sports-Related Ophthalmology Issues in Elite Sports. So it sounds a little bit dry, just reading the title, and then I'm thinking, how many Olympic athletes will I ever see in my career? Is this really relevant? But I persevered. It had a really good abstract, which drew me in, and I persevered. And I hope you both agree that actually there's a lot of really useful information in it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that actually elite athletes and us regular folk who are just enjoying sports for the fun of it have an awful lot in common. So I thought it was a good translational piece from the theory of what we should all be doing for elite athletes to what we can actually do in clinic when we're advising people, and potentially have future athletes. So, Olympic athletes don't just appear out of nowhere. We see them as children. They're playing sports maybe at a junior level, but, we need to be able to advise them and their parents how they can look after their eye health long term.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is a panel of sports medicine physicians, ophthalmologists, sports scientists. I think they even had like a sports performance psychologist on the panel as well. It seems like it's a great kind of consensus statement relating ophthalmology and sports.
That's right. They went out of their way, I think, to have a very broad group from several different countries. It is mainly European, but they do have the US and Asia represented as well. But they've come at it from different angles, which is good because there are geographic and cultural differences. So, sunlight exposure is a really good one. You're very unlikely to get too much UV exposure in Ireland or Scotland playing sports in the wintertime, but that's not the case if you're skiing in places that get a little bit more sun. And then equally, there are sports that are played in every country in the world, and then there are some that are only played in certain parts of certain countries. So everyone, I think, needs to think about their own local needs, but then there are some things that just translate everywhere. So it's great to have a really diverse panel.
Yeah, what were some of the things that you found most insightful or influential from this article.
I liked the fact that they didn't assume that we all have a, a base knowledge in ophthalmology, because as you both mentioned earlier, some of us are exposed to ophthalmology theoretically, just from reading ourselves. In medical school, you may get very little, if any, clinical exposure. And then some of us are specializing in ophthalmology. So if you're an orbital surgeon and you see emergencies, you're probably going to be very familiar with a lot of this, even if you never attend a sporting event. But for maybe a comprehensive or general ophthalmologist, you don't see those cases very often. And then if you're not training in ophthalmology at all, it may all seem quite alien. So they give a really good overview of, the anatomy of the eye and why each element of that is relevant to the exam. And they give some very practical tools. So they have some pro formas, on how to do the eye exam. They don't just say, do a test for saccades. They explain what that is, why it's important, and then they give you a way of recording that. So I felt, even though I was put off by the title, I said, what am I doing reading this? This isn't for me. I'm not academic enough. Actually, I felt it was one of the best primers that I've ever read in ophthalmology on how to think about a problem. So I think they did a really good job with that.
Yeah, I think it's a great kind of marriage between sports medicine physicians and ophthalmologists.
And Sydney mentioned earlier how sports are categorized as low, medium, and high risk, and how swimming and diving, say, are categorized. And I don't know if you both were struck, but I thought it was interesting that skiing is low risk, which I would not have thought it would be, and rugby is moderate risk. And having played rugby, I would have put it a bit higher up. But then badminton and cricket are high risk. And of course, when you think about it, these are badminton and cricket. You have very small projectiles flying through the air at high speed, and you're not wearing facial protection. So for eyes, of course, they are much higher risk. But I don't know if you two both found that interesting as well, that we don't necessarily think about risk the way we should.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just kind of spelling out this panel for those that are just listening. There's the high risk, moderate risk, and low risk sports. The high risk are defined as small, high-speed, dense projectiles close to the athletes, with fingers close to the athletes, or the use of a bat or a stick that has potential to injure athletes. The moderate risk is a high-speed ball, having a bat or a stick, and aggressive body contact. And a low-risk sport doesn't involve a hit ball or a stick or a bat or aggressive play. And so that places, badminton and rifle shooting, boxing in the high risk kind of sports, moderate risk being American football, rugby, as mentioned, water polo in the moderate risk group, and then low risk being cycling, track and field, those types of things. So I guess something that's interesting is that, is it risk of most severe injury, or is it risk of any injury at all? Because some of the epidemiological studies on basketball, for example, if you look at emergency room presentations of eye injuries, basketball is actually a majority in depending on the study that you're looking at, but also the majority of those are just abrasions or simple contusions, whereas something more intense like say badminton or boxing, not only are they the less severe injuries more often, but maybe more potential to have a more devastating injury.
But they mention in the paper that you do have to be careful when looking at sports, because some sports can seem overrepresented, because soccer or football is played all over the world. Hurling is really only played in Ireland. So if you have 100 eye injuries from each, then percentage-wise, hurling is much riskier. So they did mention that, and they mentioned also that there are really very few high-quality, high-level studies on eye injuries. So, like you both have been saying, at ASOT or one of these international meetings, you will see posters and presentations of maybe some of the severe eye injuries. but we don't really know what the denominator is. We don't know how many people are playing these, and how many people are getting a minor injury. So there might be loads of minor injuries that we never see or hear about, but we see some of the severe ones. So it can be tricky to put it into context, and it really has to be done individually for each sport. And of course, an injury can mean something very different depending on your age and your lifestyle as well. So all of that has to be taken into account in terms of severity.
I appreciate in this article how they talk about some of the more high quality studies and what that entails. And so I kind of looked briefly at it, but Connor, could you help me understand, what would a very high quality, high level epidemiological study entail? I think they mentioned like a prospective cohort study. So you take 500 individuals and then, get information on them and then check in with them every year and see, hey, are you playing this sport? Have you had any injuries yet? Is that kind of what we're looking at?
Exactly, and I should have mentioned at the beginning that this is an expert panel. So this is the sort of foundational or first step in the building the pyramid of knowledge. So while everyone who's contributed to this has a lot of knowledge, some of it will be anecdotal, kind of unfiltered information. And they mentioned that some of the studies are on single sports, others are on multiple sports. So it can be difficult to wade through it all and build really high quality information. And as you said, it can be very retrospective. So you're looking at emergency department attendance. So if someone doesn't turn up to the ER, then that's not counted. So we don't know what's handled, by a pharmacist, for example, or by a nurse practitioner in their primary care office. We can't see the data that aren't reported. And actually, just to mention, in the UK, the Royal College of Ophthalmologists has the British Ophthalmic Surveillance Unit. It's the only one of its kind in the world, and they have an active reporting mechanism for whichever condition they're looking at. So they've run, I think, 85 plus different projects, and they would look at, for example, they've looked at eye injuries from laser pointers, and they have a system where every ophthalmologist in the country receives an email and they're asked, have you seen this or have you not seen it? And you click a button. And that is really the way that we would want to look at eye injuries in sports as well. So we would ideally love to ask every eye care professional around the world, have you seen an eye injury from table tennis? Yes or no. In the last month? Yes or no. And that would be really prospective. And you would get all of the no's as well. So, you would say, look, it's only 0.5% of ophthalmologists ever see this. So this is probably relatively rare. So those are the ideal scenarios, but we can't really do that in real life, not in every scenario anyway. So ideally we would have prospective trials, but that's where sports physicians and team setup really play a big role. So, as you mentioned earlier, instead of just sending someone to the ER feeling that you don't have the skills, this paper actually gives people a lot of the tools that they need to do a really good pitch side assessment, but even a step before that, to do some screening and to start thinking about, what could crop up and what do we need to do for the lifetime of this athlete. So during their time training, during their time at the peak of their career, and then afterwards, maybe when they retire from professional sports, thinking about that throughout their career. So we probably should be looking to do something in that as well, watching what happens to athletes throughout their career so that we can prevent not just eye injuries, but systemic problems like neurocognitive changes, which we know can be indicated early in the optic nerve, for example, or eye movements.
Yeah, the article does give kind of a minimum equipment for a sports medicine physician to examine and manage an eye injury on the field. So I like how it is a practical thing and say, hey, these are some things you might appreciate having on hand for when these things come up. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask Sydney about swimming in particular, because swimming is my favorite Olympic sport, I think. I really enjoy it. And I have seen some bad eye injuries from swimming. So actually from triathlons, I've seen someone who had an injury. They were struck when they were swimming. Someone else kicked them and they got a bad blunt trauma. And someone else who actually was using an anti-misting spray in their goggles. So they thought they were doing the right thing wearing goggles. The anti-misting spray then gave them an ocular surface burn. So you do see some unusual and sometimes severe problems with swimming. But I was wondering if you thought that swimming was well covered in this, because they did mention the ocular surface of the eye, but I wasn't sure if they really mention it. And swimming is kind of a universal sport, both competitively but for recreation as well.
Yeah, I'll agree with you completely on that. I think there's definitely a lot of different, settings that swimming or being in a pool can occur. So I think there's plenty of room for injury. I definitely know some like anecdotal things from my career of, yeah, you get into a like warm up pool is what we do at a swim meet where there's, I would say, close to 100 people in a like pretty small pool just getting in their warm up, and it's very close contact and it feels like a contact sport at that point. So I think that is room for an injury there. And I think same with a triathlon where you're all in the water together in close proximity. I also think that just being on a pool deck with the slippery conditions also is just at risk for a lot of different types of injury, including ophthalmic. So it's that's just swimming in general, not just the water sports that you can do moving at fast speeds or water polo, which is also, it looked like on that paper it was deemed medium risk, which is at least good. It's getting more recognition because I hear of a lot of injuries with that as well. So, but yeah, I think they didn't touch on it as much in that paper from what I saw. I think it was, just deemed low risk and not as discussed, but I think there certainly is room for that, and kind of hoping to be able to do that with the work we're doing, I think is important. So I think there's a lot of, room to grow with a lot of these sports, just talking about all of the potentials for risk, because I think discussing the potentials is really how prevention will then occur.
So I think that if we are encouraging people to play more sports, which we are all the time, because now we know the health. So it's not just about, your cardiovascular health and maintaining a healthy weight, but it's also about your cognitive abilities. So we want children in particular to be out and about. So, we want them to be outdoors to prevent myopia. So from an ophthalmology point of view, but we know as well that, healthy lungs and heart keeps the brain healthy, and they'll be better learners and live happier, longer lives. So if we're going to advise them to do that and to go swimming, for example, or to go and play soccer, then we need to know what the potential risks are, so that we can look after them long term. And I thought swimming came to mind when they were talking about dry eye, because dry eye disease sometimes is minimized, but if in your daily life it can be very uncomfortable. And if you're a high performance athlete, maybe you need to wear contact lenses for practical reasons, or you might feel that you should get refractive surgery. It can be tricky if that's not available to you because you have dry eye, and if that's exacerbated by the chlorine in the pool. These are things that can really affect people's performance. And sport has such a huge psychological component, that you can find that it impacts people's mental health and even their sleep patterns. So I thought that was interesting that they did mention it, but I think there could be more. And swimming and sailing, you're often outdoors in the sea, you get a lot of reflected light. So should we be thinking more about UV protection and glare?
Yeah, I mean this article is wide and then also deep into what it goes into. It also touches on esports or electronic sports. It estimates that half the world's population, or 3 billion, are estimated to be playing games regularly, and 90% of computer users who spend more than 3 hours a day in front of the computer screen suffer from computer vision syndrome, or a kind of type of dry eye and things like that. And so, what lessons are we learning from these e-athletes that are playing video games 12 hours a day, and what effect does that have on the eye, and then how can those insights be translated to help residents in the hospital who are staring at a computer screen for 3 hours a day, and promoting their eye health as well.
I don't know how you find electronic health records, but it can definitely feel like you're playing a game of some kind. But I wouldn't call it sports when you're staring at the screen for hours on end. But that was actually a really enjoyable piece of the paper for me. I don't know how you both felt about it. When I glanced at it, I said, "Oh, this is a bit unusual," and I kind of did a double take. But it is really interesting to think about because you have to meet people where they are, and if people are playing sports, using this technology, that's fantastic, and they probably have interests in other sports. So that may be a way of promoting, really good practice. So if you're playing esports online and there's some way of maybe providing some education and information through that as a medium, so you can help people's eye health while they're playing esports, but also they may translate that into other sports that they play. And so that's something we can think about, whether that's another avenue for us to get the message across.
And one thing I was like kind of taken by at the very beginning of the paper is an aspect of it that I feel like when I've read other sports related like ophthalmic injury type papers, it's very focused on injury to the eye, and that's really the main focus. Whereas this paper started out saying, oh, injury to the eye or anything that affects your vision can then lead to injury to the whole body if you're not, especially these elite athletes who have, certain things that are in their whatever sport they're playing that could injure them if they're not, fully aware of their surroundings using their vision. So I thought that was an interesting next step is okay, if your vision is affected, it's going to affect, really just your overall health. And I really kind of liked that aspect of it.
Yeah, I think the article integrates a lot of the different aspects of sports ophthalmology, making it not just about the ocular trauma, like you're saying, but also like performance vision. And they also touch on prevention and eye protection and screening of athletes and making sure that we're catching other pathologies too that are not only hindering their performance, but might affect their vision long term. I think we could talk about this paper a long time, but I think we should close it up. Connor, do you have anything else to add towards the end here?
Yeah, I could give you my takeaways, and maybe you could tell us whether you agree. Both of you agree. So I think the number one takeaway is to be prepared, right? So we want to be thinking about eye health in sports from the very beginning, from when children play sports for the very first time at home, on the lawn, or in school, and to give them good habits. So we know from a lot of different countries have brought in eye protection requirements. So they mention in the article in Scandinavia, they have to play sports with eye protection. It's the same in Ireland. Hurling is one of the fastest ball sports in the world. There were always a lot of injuries associated, but now since 2010, I think we have to wear helmets, even for adults, and that has made a big difference to concussion and I'm sure to eye injuries, even though we don't have the data on that yet. So I think education for participants, for their parents, for their communities, for the teams, and also for ophthalmologists and other healthcare providers, having pro formas and structured ways of assessing patients. So screening, knowing what we need to look for before someone steps out onto the pitch, because if you only have good vision in one eye, then you really have to protect the second eye. So that sort of provision of basic information and guidelines are really useful. And having the right equipment, as you mentioned in the paper, they have a really good summary of what you need pitch side, but also having an on-call ophthalmologist, knowing who to call if you have a corneal injury versus a retinal injury. So, you don't need every subspecialty of ophthalmology covered, but I think it's a good idea for teams, whether they're local junior teams all the way up to professional teams, to have an idea of who their eye care team should include. The other big takeaway is that severe injuries are rare, but they can be devastating. And exactly as Sydney said, you may have an eye injury that doesn't seem particularly serious, but it can affect their sports performance in other ways, or it can affect their lives outside of sport. And to think about the near misses and micro injuries. So just because it isn't a globe rupture doesn't mean that it isn't going to cause trouble down the line. And the big takeaway is that 90% of sports eye injuries are preventable. So there's a big opportunity here for us to spread that message and hopefully to do something about it at the local level in our own units, but maybe even on state or national policy.
Thank you for those takeaways, Connor. Before we head out, do you have a favorite sport and or favorite sports team?
Yeah, I'd say, my favorite sport to participate in has always been swimming, but I have recently gotten into golf, which is a new thing for me. So I got my own clubs a few weeks ago. So I think that's may or may not become my new favorite sport. We'll see. But I mean, I've always been, I think when it comes to watching and cheering for sports, football has been the big one. My family's always been a big New England Patriots fan group. So I always enjoy watching those games on Sundays.
I've done a lot of solo sports, so I do love kayaking, and I don't go too far on my own, but I like that it gives me a break away from the hustle and bustle of daily life and overthinking things. So kayaking is super, and you get out into nature. But I shout for Munster in rugby. So in Ireland, it's divided into 4 provinces. So you have Munster, Leinster, Connacht, and Ulster. So I'm from Munster. So by default, I have to shout for them. But also they're a great team and have been European champions a couple of times. And then in hurling, I'm from Tipperary. So Ireland is further divided into 32 counties, and each county has a hurling team. And thankfully, Tipperary are one of the top hurling counties. So we've had a few wins as well.
Well, it's been great to get to know both of you, and I look forward to continuing to hear more from you and learn from each of you as we move forward with the podcast. So thanks for your help.
Thanks,
Jared.
Thank you for listening to Sports Ophthalmology. To stay connected and learn more, you can find us on Twitter, YouTube, and at our website, sportsophthalmology.com.